Look at how the sages totally mess with the text. In the biblical portion of Parashat Shelach, there's a truly interesting and significant story about how Moses sends the chosen spies to scout the promised land. And then in chapter 13, it explicitly says they returned with a remarkable cluster of grapes, and this impressive cluster of grapes, this is what is written about it. And they carried it on a pole between two. They carried the cluster of grapes on a pole between two people. Now, what do we understand from this when we read this verse? That they took the cluster of grapes and apparently carried it on a pole between two, one at this end and another at the other end. It's really simple. Now look, the sages not only mess with the text, but look at what they focus on. They argue about nonsense. They start to debate what the weight of the cluster of grapes was. Come on, is this whole thing serious? Now, I'm not just saying they're worse than Shaoli's parliament for nothing because they just sit around chatting and making claims. And not only do they make baseless claims, as we'll soon see in the discussion, but they also deal with unimportant topics. Why does it matter how much that cluster of grapes weighed? They're serious. So let's take a look. In Tractate Sota, page 34a, pay attention to the nonsense of the sages. It's simply unbelievable. Rabbi Yehuda said, Rabbi Yehuda comes and makes the following claim. He tells a story, like some little kid telling a story. Abba Chalafta, and Rabbi Eliezer ben Mattia and Kanania ben Chachinai, they stood firmly on those ancient stones and carefully weighed each and every one of them, and each individual stone weighed approximately 40 seah, a significant amount. Rabbi Yehuda comes and tells us that when Joshua built the altar with 12 stones, each tribal leader lifted a stone. And they crossed with that stone, carried the stone, and crossed the Jordan. That's what's written in the book of Joshua, that they simply carried stones across. And here Rabbi Yehuda says, you know that Rabbi Abba Halafta, Rabbi Eliezer ben Mattia, and Hananiah ben Chachinai, they physically saw these stones that Joshua built, that he moved the massive stones, that they carried the stones across. And each stone, they showed the stones, of course, they saw the stone and determined that each one weighed about 40 seah. Now, 40 seah, the volume of 40 seah, 1 seah is 110 liters. So 40 seah, multiply that by 40 seah. It comes out according to the calculation that I did. It turns out that each stone that those princes lifted weighed 11 tons per stone based on the specific gravity of stone. 11 tons. So each prince lifted a stone weighing 11 tons. Now how does this connect to the story of the spies with the cluster of grapes? Here it is. So if we now know that each one carried 11 tons of stone, which is 40 seah, then they say the following. We are Jews. They come and establish a rule that any weight a person can lift, if he lifts it together with another person helping him, the two of them together will be able to lift 3 times as much weight. Here they say, and in their language they say, and it is taught that the load a person can lift onto his shoulders is 1/3 of the load. 1/3 means 3 times as much. In other words, if one person can lift 40 seah, then 2 people will be able to lift 120 seah. Now from here, you calculate for the cluster of grapes that they carried. How do I calculate? He told me like this. It is written, and they carried it on a pole between two. He says, now look at their reasoning. What does it mean? They carried it on a pole between two. That 2 people, one at one end of the pole and one at the other end of the pole, they don't like these things. They have to overanalyze the text. So they say like this, exactly as it says on a pole. If it says, and they carried it on a pole, of course it's with 2, because you can't carry all those grapes on a pole with just one person. So I know it's with 2. So why does the text still need to say with 2? It doesn't matter. The text always speaks this way in the language of people. But suddenly here, they don't want to speak in the language of people. What does it mean to say with 2? With 2 poles. So how many people would carry it? If it's not a pole, if with a pole it's 2 people, with 2 poles it's 4 people, multiply that by 120 se'ah and you get 480 se'ah. It turns out that the weight of the cluster of grapes, look at the terlef, it's simply unbelievable. The weight of the cluster of grapes is 55 tons, and they're carrying it on poles, and the pole doesn't break, 55 tons. Understand, that's more than a truck. It's an insane weight. Heavier than the missiles they're firing at us from Iran. This craziness is simply unbelievable. And the important thing I want to say is, aside from all this nonsense they're exaggerating and so on, what are you even dealing with? Why does it matter? What's the point? Now look, they keep going on about this. These are the words of Rabbi Yehuda. But Rabbi Yitzchak says, no. Rabbi Yitzchak said, it's simply unbelievable. Rabbi Yitzchak said that actually they carried, the wording here is Toratani v'Toratani de Toratani. The commentators explain that according to Rabbi Yitzchak, 8 people carried the cluster of grapes. He took 2 poles from here, 2 poles from there. Each pole is 2 people, so it turns out they carried it with 8 poles. And how is it that 8 people carried one cluster? A cluster. 1 stayed with him and 1, it doesn't matter. So according to this, if we do our calculation, which is 3 times as much, every time another person joins, you multiply the weight by 3. According to this calculation, the weight of the cluster of grapes is 105 tons. It's a crazy mistake. It's the madness of Chazal. What's funny is that the logo of the Ministry of Tourism is exactly this cluster of grapes. And there it's depicted as being carried by only 2 people. Just as it is literally called there. That is, they completely removed Chazal's crazy interpretations. Now, what's interesting about this whole thing is that the believers, the dwellers, always know how to create contradictions for the other believer. It doesn't matter whether it's a religious believer or a political or ideological one. Take for example Yinon Magal, who is always finding craziness among people who are anti-Bibi, and he does it very skillfully, to be honest. But as a believer, when you show him this craziness from Chazal, Bibi, bring me water, he'll stay silent. He simply won't go on channel 14 and say, Chazal are crazy. He won't do that. He won't come and present Chazal as lunatics and bring up that midrash. How much did the grapes weigh? And besides that, I think Hamas needs to be eliminated.